I think there are two kind of travel writers. The travel writers that embark upon an inner journey, maybe not so planned, and their goal is maybe to learn more about themselves. But I always have an outer question that I want to find an answer to. In this book, the navigators, Seefahrer, I had two questions. So it was, why did Portugal become such a big empire, the Portuguese Empire? Why was it the first global empire? How did it come to be? And then the second question was, well, what is left? What is the heritage today of this huge, long-lasting global empire?
Welcome to a new episode of Dichtung und Wahrheit, a podcast dedicated to the authors of German publishing houses Suhrkamp and Insel. My name is Annika von Taube. I moderate this podcast, usually in German, but today we have a guest with us whose work is of a truly global nature, and we'd like to make this conversation accessible to an international audience, not just a German one. Hence, this conversation will be in English. So who's with us today? Erika Fatland, an anthropologist and a travel writer of international acclaim, whose latest book, The Navigators, a journey tracing the legacy of the Portuguese Empire, turned out a huge success in Norway last year and is now available in German, titled Seefahrer. We are very happy to have her here with us today. Welcome, Erika Fatland.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here.
Erika, we're catching you in Berlin, in fact, because you just presented this new book, The Navigators, in Berlin to the German audience last night. And I reckon, you travel a lot. You need to travel. It's a prerequisite for your books. But I have a feeling once a book is finished, the traveling doesn't end. Is that true?
Yes, that is absolutely true. And then the book is being translated. And for me, that is just a huge bonus, because then my work is done and the translators are working hard, very hard. And then the book is kind of reborn in country after country. And it's becoming accessible to more readers. And I'm very happy about that. Also because Norwegian is a very small language. We are just a little bit more than 5 million people. So even if Norwegian people are reading still, the audience is limited. So I'm so happy that the book can travel abroad.
So being a traveler, how does it feel to actually stay put in a place for a bit of time? Do you actually ever do that, and do you like it?
I don't stay put in a place very long, actually. Now I was just at home for 6 days in a row, and that was a new record for this year.
Wow.
So I do travel a lot, and maybe sometimes too much. So actually now I'm kind of longing to stay at home for a longer period of time. And after Germany now, I will be at home for 3 weeks, which is a new record for sure.
And what place do you call home?
I live in Oslo.
In Oslo.
Yes.
And
that is where I have my address, but I'm very rarely there.
Yeah, I figured. I read in one of your books, The Border, where you travel the Russian border and passing all the bordering countries from your home country, Norway, in fact, to North Korea. And their border is 60,000 kilometers long, I read. And this is a book that you dedicated to your mother. And it says in that dedication, it's to my mother who gave me wings. So is this wanderlust of yours something that actually runs in the family?
Yeah, I think it runs in the genes. My mother also, she left home early and she went as a high school student to the US, and she loved traveling. But then unfortunately she had me and she could not travel so much anymore. But me and my siblings, we have all traveled quite a lot. And I come from a very small village in Norway. So my first kind of big journey went to France, but then I was just a high school student and I went to high school in France. And for me, that was kind of groundbreaking, because then as a 16-year-old, I had to manage almost on my own in a new country, learn a new language, a new culture. And I felt that after dealing with French electricity companies. As a 17-year-old, I could manage anything.
Right. Very interesting to see, though, that at one point you got drawn towards Central Asia, right? Because Sovjetistan, that is one of your first books where you traveled all the stands. Was this your first major journey?
It was my first travel book.
Yeah.
So by education, I'm a social anthropologist, and I did my fieldwork in Beslan in North Ossetia in the North Caucasus in Russia about the aftermath of the terrible hostage crisis at school number 1 in 2004. And then after finishing the master thesis, this became my first nonfiction book. But that was not a travel book. It was a book about trauma and tragedy, a very dark subject. But it was when I've always been extremely fascinated by Russia and the former Soviet Union. And it kind of burns down to the size of this enormous country. It's so huge. But when I was in North Ossetia doing my master thesis, I realized that, and this is quite obvious, that Russia is not, there are not only Russians living in Russia, there are so many other peoples, and in North Ossetia they are not Russians. On my first day, I offended everyone by calling them Russians, because to me they looked Russian, they spoke Russian, but they said, no, we are not Russian, we are Ossetian. And that was kind of, I think, gave me was the beginning of the idea to write Sovjetistan, because these countries in Central Asia, ending with Stan, they were also part of the Soviet Union, but the culture is very, very different from the Russian one. They have Turkish languages, they were Muslim. So then I was just curious, how were these countries affected by that huge social experiment? What came out on the other sides? And to me, those countries, the Stans, they were like a white dot on the map. So I was also driven by curiosity.
Right. They still are to a certain point at this day. And it was super, super difficult for you to travel to some of them, right? Turkmenistan, I read you sneaked into the country and almost didn't get back out?
Yes, Turkmenistan is one of the most authoritarian countries in the world. It's called, and with good reason, this North Korea of Central Asia. And it's you can't go there by yourself. You need to go with a travel agency. You need to be followed by a guide most places you go. So obviously I could not tell them that I'm going here to write a book.
Right.
So at that point I was younger than I'm now, so I just wrote that I'm a student. And that's how I kind of sneaked in. And luckily I got out again. And I had kind of the same experience when I later went to North Korea. Again, I could not tell them that I was going there to write a book. Then I was a little bit too old, and I was also not studying anymore. And the embassy in Stockholm, they demanded a letter from my employer as a proof to where I was working. And so my family on the father's side in Norway, they are running a slaughterhouse. It's actually the biggest private slaughterhouse in Norway. Myself, wow. I'm a vegetarian. But finally, this heritage came in handy. And I got a letter saying I was working as a receptionist at the slaughterhouse. And it was the perfect background story. Like, no one wanted to know anything about my boring work.
That's a great story. Well, now to your latest book. It's set in, many, many countries. In fact, you traveled over a period of 12 months within a time span of more than 2 years. You crossed 4 continents. You traveled to 25 countries. You are an anthropologist, so I do understand that you obviously don't plan your journeys like it's tourist would, right? And you have not just an interest like a geographical or topographical interest, you all have a place, like you also have an interest, or more probably of an interest in the narratives that places provide. So I do understand that your travel has to be somewhat more extensive, yet the scope of, I think, all of your journeys is just so impressive. And I'm wondering, why this massive scope?
That's a good question. I think there are kind of basically 2 kind of travel writers. The travel writers that embark upon an inner journey, maybe not so planned, and their goal is maybe to learn more about themselves. But I always have an outer question that I want to find an answer to. So in The Border, that question was, what is it like to have the biggest country in the world as your neighbor? And then in this book, the navigators, Seefahrer, the question, well, I had two questions. So it was, why did Portugal become such a big empire, the Portuguese empire? Why was it the first global empire? How did it come to be? And then the second question was, well, what is left? What is the heritage today of this huge, long-lasting global empire?
Now, the first global empire, the Portuguese were seafarers. They produced a lot of the so-called great explorers, Vasco da Gama, Ferdinand Magellan. You yourself have been called a modern-day explorer. Do you feel any kinship with these great explorers of the past?
Not at all. And the more I have read about these great explorers, I mean, the less I like them. Like Vasco da Gama, I think if you had met him, you would certainly not have liked him. He was, even for his time, he was known for his short temper. And he was, like so many of that time, a religious fanatic. He sincerely hated Muslims and spent an unnecessary big amount of time of killing and pursuing Muslims. So he was really brutal, but without doubt, a very skilled and very brave navigator. And I think the journey that Vasco da Gama made around Africa and finding the sea route to India is much more important than the journey of Columbus. I mean, Columbus had no clue about what he was doing and where he was going and where he had been. I mean, until his death, he claimed that he had found the sea route to India.
Right.
But what Vasco da Gama did really changed the world. I mean, so my first travel book was Sovietistan, and then that is about also the Silk Route, Samarkand, and all these important cities along the Silk trading route. But after Vasco da Gama's sea journey to India, the Silk Route just died. It lost importance, and Central Asia was not central anymore. After that, the seas, the ocean was becoming the main route, the main way of transporting, and that has continued until today. When you go to a shop, a store, a warehouse, I mean, almost everything you can buy there was brought to us on ships.
Right. Speaking of which, you yourself did quite a bit of traveling on ship. You traveled on a container vessel because I guess you wanted to follow, not in the footsteps because there are no footsteps on sea, but I guess you wanted to trace how they traveled and you wanted to pass the places that the seafarers back then passed. It's very interesting to realize when I read your writing, it feels to me like you're passing two spaces simultaneously. You're passing the geographical space, but then also time as space, because there's always an historical component. And that's like, I think, a specialty of yours, weaving together historical background and your own modern day, your own individual experience. There was a very interesting episode in your book, The Navigators, that to me exemplifies this very well. And it's about Cape Bojador, which had a massive impact on the formation of the Portuguese Empire. But today, the place is probably not as much ingrained in people's, collective memory anymore. Would you mind describing to us, or just explaining to us, the original function of Cape Bojador and what it is today?
Yes, of course. So my book is in Norwegian. The title is just Sjøfareren, which is singular. And in German and English, it's the plural form, seafarers. So my book was originally named after Henry the Navigator. And he did not navigate much himself. I mean, the longest he traveled by sea was just across the Strait of Gibraltar to Morocco.
Still, he's called Heinrich der Seefahrer in German, and people think he spent his life basically on sea.
Yes. Yeah. So, but he was very important. He is the father of the Portuguese Empire, even if he did not travel much himself, because what he did was very important. He sponsored expeditions. And he was living at the beginning of the 15th century. And at that time, European sailors, they did not sail very far. So like the physical border was around the Canary Islands, and the utmost limit was Cape Bojador, which is today in Western Sahara. And at that time, the sailors used to navigate close to land, which was safer. And there at Cape Bojador, the sea is not deep, and there are some very difficult winds and currents. So no one dared or managed to pass that difficult place. But Henry the Navigator, he was convinced that it is possible to pass Cape Bojador. And his goal was then to get access to the gold that they knew were to be found somewhere in Africa, because there was a lot of gold in North Africa, and it had to come from somewhere. This is also kind of typical of these expeditions, that the motivation was always to become rich. Right. It was always greed. Right. It was never a will to explore the world. No, they wanted to get rich.
Really? You really think there was no intrinsic motivation to just experience the world and to discover something, be the first to set foot on land and just...
No, I don't think that was the motivation. Maybe for a few of the navigators, but for most of them, the goal was to become rich. It was also the goal of Vasco da Gama. They went to India not because they wanted to experience India and different cultures. No, they wanted to have access to the spice markets in India, which was very important. And also, all this is, when you read about these navigators like Columbus and Vasco da Gama, they are so concerned about titles. They want to have nice titles. They want to become Dom, Vasco da Gama, etc. So that's very important to them. But anyway, Henry the Navigator, he was a prince, so he already had a title, and he was rich. So that is why he had the means to finance these expeditions, and he sent expedition after expedition down the coast of Africa, and they all failed and came back to Lisbon without managing to pass this difficult cape. But then in 1434, a sailor named Gilles Eanes, he succeeded in passing the cape, but the weather was bad, so he had to sail far from the coast, and that of course became the key to master the whole Atlantic Ocean, to follow the currents and the winds and not sail close to land. And after that, the whole coast of Africa was open to the Portuguese, and they could just now continue further and further south. So that was like the very important beginning of the Portuguese Empire. And as you said, most of my journey, most of the research for this book is done on land. I visited 29 countries around the world, former Portuguese colonies and territories. But I also, this was a maritime empire, so I also wanted to do a sea journey, not on a sailboat, because that's not mainly how we do it today. So I was lucky, and I was allowed to board a car freight ship in Spain, and then went all the way down to south of Africa, and then continued to Yokohama in Japan. And I remember when we were passing Cape Bojador, I was kind of, looking at the map, and this was kind of an exciting, important point for me. And I asked the captain if maybe today it was also a bit difficult. Maybe there were some problems with the weather there, and maybe this was also today a problem. And he looked at me with these kind of blank eyes, and then he had to check on Google Maps where this cape was located, because he had never heard about Cape Bojador before.
And that's why, when I read that, I realized how, you view the world through the lens of the anthropologist, the historian, the writer, and it adds a layer to everything that you make it come alive through your writing, but otherwise to many people it's lost today. And it's interesting to see how some places still have, they are still full of history, and you have visited other places where I feel time and space are one. And then there are places like Cape Bojador, when I first read about it, it was considered the end of the world. I found that fascinating. And then today it's what is it? So let's speak a bit more about your experience on this vessel, because of course, I checked your Instagram, and there was a post announcing this trip, and you said you were going to spend about 50 days on the boat, and you were wondering about how to spend it, and then you said, of course, I will get a lot of writing done. In fact, you called it a floating writer's prison. You also mentioned that you're prone to seasickness, and then There is a little episode in the book where it actually becomes quite clear that you did not get that much writing done after all. But I wanted to ask you about this writing process, because obviously you do preliminary research and then you spend a lot of time writing once the journey is done. But do you actually write during the journey, and how do you organize that writing?
So during the research, when I'm traveling, I kind of write a diary, a very detailed one about what's happening every day, whom I talked with, what they said. And I try.
Laptop, or do you have a Moleskine notebooks or something?
I have both.
Okay.
So usually I use the small laptops, but sometimes I can just take notes by hand. It depends on where I am. And then when I write the book, I use this very detailed diary as a background material. So sometimes whole pages from the diary almost go directly into the book without much editing, and other times I have to edit a lot. I did get a lot of writing done on the boat, though, luckily. So we started with the worst part, which is the Bay of Biscay, Biscaya, which is known to be difficult and with the high waves. But then luckily most of the coast of Africa, it was very, very calm. And I did get a lot of writing done. And also without much disturbances. So it was a writing prison, but like a perfect one, because I mean the internet connection was very, 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 very slow. So I did not have that distraction.
Right.
And also for once I had like a routine. There was breakfast, there was lunch, there was dinner, and then in between the meals there was nothing to do except for writing.
Right. Have you ever lost any material?
If I've ever lost any material? No, I haven't, luckily.
Oh, that's good. And how do you pick what actually goes into the book? Or no, other way around. Have you ever encountered any situations, people had any conversations that you felt you couldn't include, or you didn't want to because they were too personal, intimate, or gruesome, maybe?
Oh, that's a good question. So not in this book. I mean, of course, there is a lot of material that does not go into the book, but it's not because it's too gruesome. It's just because it's not relevant. I mean, I always try to pick stories and encounters that somehow will enlighten aspects of the Portuguese Empire. So it has to be relevant somehow. And that's how I try to pick my stories. Actually, when I start writing the book, I try not to look at my diaries, not to look at my notes, and I just pick what I remember. Because I think what I remember is what obviously was most important and made the biggest impression on me. And then I have a look at my notes, of course, and see if I forgot something. But there has been times, yes, in other countries for other books when I have not used material that they had. For instance, in Tibet. I mean, Tibet is, I think, even worse than North Korea in terms of how the government is checking people, following people. So there were people in Tibet who told me very interesting stories and thoughts on politics that I just simply could not write, because that would put them in huge danger and they would most probably end up in jail.
Right.
And no book is worth that.
Absolutely. When you plan your journeys ahead, how much of it is actually specifically planned and how much do you leave open?
Well, I have read in reviews about the books that I'm such a great planner and that everywhere I go there are guides waiting for me and I'm so organized, and I'm quite flattered by this, but it's not true at all. I'm not a great planner. So, and also it would be very difficult to plan in detail this long research and visit in 29 countries. So what I did, I did not do all of the 29 countries in one journey. I did have some breaks in between. But what I do is that I buy flight tickets so that I have some kind of limitations, because otherwise, I could have stayed in Angola for 3 years and still not finished the research. There is so much. All these countries are so big and so interesting. So to give myself a limit, so that the book will be finished at some point, I buy flight tickets. So then I know, okay, I will be three weeks in Guinea-Bissau, and then I will be 3 weeks in Sao Tome and Principe, etc. And then I land, and this is kind of the same story every time. Then I land in Bissau, And I have booked the first 2-3 nights in a hotel. And then I have absolutely no plan. I just know that I will be here for 3 weeks and I better get some good research done. And I need to have some good interviews and so on. But it's most of the time without a plan. And then I just start panicking and try to find some contacts. And most of the time I am very lucky. Like in Guinea-Bissau, very quickly I managed to find a young student of journalism, Wagner, who luckily had some vacation and he was able to help me and travel around with me. And thanks to him, I did manage to do some incredible research in Guinea-Bissau. And we went to the Bissagos Islands outside of the coast of Guinea-Bissau. And I mean, I'm educated as an anthropologist. And so, I've never worked as an anthropologist, but I spent months as a student reading about rituals in the Amazon and in Papua New Guinea. But none of these rituals could compare to the rituals in the Bissagos Islands, which is, I would say, some of the more special rituals I've ever heard about. So if you have time, I can tell about them.
Yes, of course, please.
Otherwise, you have to read the book.
Yeah, exactly. Just give us a little teaser.
Yeah. So the Bissagos Islands, this is also quite important, I think, to have in the back of the mind when we talk about the Portuguese Empire. So these islands, they were not really controlled by the Portuguese until 1936. And this is also quite typical of the Portuguese Empire, that they would usually just control parts of the coast and not much else of the countries. And that it was like that until the end of the 19th century, and then the race for Africa began, and every European country wanted to have colonies in Africa, and then the Portuguese, they got competition, and they had to build infrastructure and colonize also the inland. And the reason why the Bissagos Islands, of course coastal area, were not colonized is because the inhabitants were so stubborn and difficult. So actually the Portuguese didn't manage to control them before 1936. So this means that the people on these islands, they have lived relatively undisturbed by Europeans. And I read before I got there that it's matriarchate, that the women are in charge, which is quite rare. As far as I could understand, the men had the last words, but still the women have this very strong role in this society. And they can decide whom they want to marry.
Right.
So if a woman wants to marry a man, she gets help from her mother to make a huge festive meal. And if the man eats, and he always does, then they are married. But these men, I mean, there are lots of different rituals, but there is like this last ritual for a man, like if he wants to like become a man with a big M and move out of the hut of his parents and have his own hut with his own family. So to reach that stage, he needs to pass this last, we can call it test. And then he needs to leave all of his wives, because he can have several wives, because there is no limitation as to how many women can cook for the same man. And so he has to leave, break with all of his wives and children. He has to leave the village on this not very big island, and he has to live by himself in the bush and find his own food and not talk to anyone. And he has to live on like this, isolated, and not for 9 days, not for 9 weeks, not for 9 months, but for 9 years.
What?
Yes, that is what Wagner and I said as well. What? But nowadays, this is changing very rapidly. So the young people, they are negotiating with the elders how they can radically simplify this ritual.
process. Oh, that's a lovely story, though, because it kind of shows you how your own life differs so much from so many other lives, and that there's still so many riches in, how we lead our lives. And I kind of like the story that there's still space to make, to organize your life like this in this world. How about your own rituals? Do you have any? Or any lucky charms you take with you?
I have a teddy bear that travels with me. He's from Berlin, actually. His name is Werner, and he's not very big. I know he's getting a little old. He's the only one who will go with me for these journeys. So he's like my only company. But we have very nice conversations in the evenings.
Oh, okay. That's good to hear. Well, I mean, you do have a lot of company. I read that just like Wagner, you just told us about, you do have like temporary travel companions. I mean, sometimes you need a guide, sometimes you need someone to translate for you. I read that, well, you said that one of the questions you get asked most frequently is, isn't it terribly dangerous to travel alone and as a woman? And you said the opposite is the case because you encounter women on your journeys and they understand your situation, they can relate to you and they will offer their support. Can you give us some examples of these women that you meet along the way and how you bond with them?
Yes, that's absolutely true. It's the most common question that I get. But as you say, usually it's a huge advantage to be a woman, especially in very conservative Muslim regions where a male writer, he would only have had access to half of the population, but I can also talk to the women.
Right.
I mean, the men will talk to you anyway, but I can also access the women. So, for instance, when I was doing research for Oben, I was traveling in very conservative parts of Pakistan. And then I tried to find a female guide translator, did not succeed. So I was traveling with a man. I mean, he was very nice, but he had this disadvantage. He was a man. So he would often not be invited. I mean, even into entire villages, he would have to wait on the outside. And I was allowed into the village. And there I could meet the women and talk with the women and the men as well. So usually it's a huge advantage. And also when I was writing this book, I worked a lot with female fixers and translators and guides. And that was wonderful because, I mean, now I might sound judgmental, but often women are also better with people.
Uh-huh.
And especially they are better talking to women usually, and women will open more up to other women usually. So for instance, in Angola, I was working with a wonderful woman called Sonia. And she was not actually by profession a fixer. She was, she had done many things in her long life. And now she was driving long-distance taxi. So she was also my driver.
Yes.
And she didn't speak English. So our language of communication was Portuguese. But she would still help kind of translate from my Portuguese to the Portuguese they were talking.
And are there so many types of Portuguese? I mean...
Well, it's also that my fluency in Portuguese, I mean, I did learn Portuguese to write this book, but I get by in Portuguese and I can read Portuguese, but I might not understand slang or street language. And also in some of the countries, like in Cape Verde or in Guinea-Bissau, very few people actually speak Portuguese. They will speak Creole, which is a mix of Portuguese and African languages.
Right. Do any of these people stay with you once a journey is finished? Like, do they stay in your heart, or do they maybe become friends? Do you keep in touch with them?
Actually, I was just in Portugal, and there I met Wagner, who has now been studying documentary filmmaking in Lisbon. And it was so nice to meet him again. And it's actually not that common that I meet people again, because I always move on to new destinations. But it is very nice to stay in touch. But obviously I can't stay in touch with everyone.
Right. You said earlier in this conversation that at the beginning, when you started out as a travel writer, you were still quite inexperienced. Of course, now you have a lot of experience traveling the world. You know how they say you grow personally when you travel. I presume you would consider that to be true. What are your biggest learnings, or do you actually observe yourself when you travel and then you return? Do you actually have this feeling of, now I have grown bigger in this, or now I have more knowledge in that? And does it make you a bigger, better person?
Well, it certainly expands my view of the world. And I learned so much. I mean, no one learns more from these books than I do. Uh-huh. So when I started writing this book, The Navigators, I knew very little about the Portuguese Empire. like most people outside of Portugal.
Same here. I mean, but through your book, I actually accessed it, and then I wasn't aware that it was the first global empire, that at one point it was the biggest, and that it was the last one to die.
It was the last one. It lasted until Macau was given back to China in 1999.
Right.
And it's kind of a forgotten empire. And I think it also has to do with the Portuguese language, that it was kind of the British Empire that became, it was not the first, but it became the dominant empire. And also because of United States, English became the dominant language. And then the Portuguese Empire kind of was forgotten by the rest of us. I learn so much by each of these books. So I feel that like my brain is doubling in size after each book. So now it's
interesting, because I wanted to ask you about this overkill of information that you surely must experience. And then there are all these weird phenomena like Paris syndrome or something, where people freak out at the sight of something that they only knew about in books. Have you ever experienced anything like this?
Well, it can be overwhelming at times, especially like at the beginning of the project when everything is ahead of me and then like, where do I start? The Portuguese Empire, it was huge. Where do I start? But then you just have to begin, and you have to like think like ultra marathon runner. You can't think about the whole race. You just have to think about like the next hill,
right.
And then the next hill, and like page by page and country by country, slowly.
But how do you process information? Or can you recall any moments where you were like, oh God, this is too much for me to take?
Well, there were so many moments on this journey, and also when I'm writing the book, I do a lot of the historical research, because if I had done it beforehand, I would have forgotten it by the time I was writing the book, and I would have to do it twice. But usually it's also like one of the most fascinating parts of the research, because what I'm always looking for stories. So I'm looking for stories when I'm traveling, and I try to find people with stories, with personal stories. This time, for instance, I was looking for people who had experience with the freedom fight from the Portuguese and so on. But also when I do historical research, I look for stories. So, for instance, when I was writing about Vasco da Gama, I was reading the diary of the chronicler on board. And that was so fun, because we have all learned that Vasco da Gama found the sea route to India in 1498, and that is kind of boring information when you just put it like that as a fact. But then when I was reading this diary, they had no idea what they were doing because no one had done it before.
Right.
So there are so many misunderstandings along this journey. And just the shock that they have when they finally reach like the coast of East Africa. Right. And then they discover that, oh my God, the whole coast of East Africa is dominated by the enemy, the Muslims. That was quite a shock. And then they arrive in India. And again, they have absolutely no clue what they're doing or where they are. All they want is to find spices and buy them and get rich. So they don't understand the cultural aspects at all. So, when the Portuguese arrive in India in 1498, that's like one of the history's biggest cultural clashes taking place. And then the chronicler, he confidently concludes that most of the inhabitants in Calicut, where they have landed, are Christians.
Yeah.
Because it's so fun, because they are taking to Hindu temples and they don't understand that this is another religion, because they have never heard about Hinduism before. So all they can imagine is what they already know, Muslims, Jews, Christians, and then pagans in Africa. And now they are just in this world that they don't understand, but they try to make it fit with categories that they do understand. So the chronicler, he desperately tries to make these temples and everything they see fit into Christianity, because Krishna, Christ,
of course, that makes sense.
Kind of similar. So he must admit that the saints in India, with all their many arms and long teeth, they don't look exactly like the saints in Portugal, but he must admit they are far from home.
Yeah. Can you personally recall any personal most surprising discoveries or things you saw you just couldn't make any sense of? Or how did you deal? I think you actually do encounter a lot of things that you can't make any sense of because you have never seen them before. How do you remain open? How do you access these with an open mind? Because we all tend to, compartmentalize and to put labels on things and try to fit them into our system, our knowledge system.
Yeah, I think we all do that, and we are all probably quite judgmental. I try not to be. I try to be open. I try also when I'm writing, I try not to be judgmental so that the reader can make up his own mind. So I try always to, you should show, don't tell. That is kind of the law that we follow as writers. And I try not to conclude too much. So, my readers are very intelligent people, and I trust them to draw their own conclusions. But there were so many fascinating encounters during this research. For instance, also, I went all the way to Japan because the Portuguese were the first Europeans to set foot in Japan in 1543. And they had a huge impact on Japan, and they brought Christianity there, and eventually hundreds of thousands converted to Christianity. And this became a big threat, and Christianity was forbidden, and it became very dangerous then to be Christian. And in the 17th century, the Portuguese, they were kicked out of Japan, and Japan closed, and the Christians were persecuted, and finally there were no Christians left because it was simply too dangerous to be Christian. And then Japan was closed for 200 years. And then the Americans forced them to reopen. And French missionaries built a church in Nagasaki. And then when the church was finished, and suddenly one day some villagers arrived outside of the church and they said, "We are Christian." And the missionaries, they were so surprised. And then it turned out that these Christians, they had been living as Christians in secret for 200 years without a Bible, without a priest, and they had secretly baptized their children, given them Christian names, and they had secretly celebrated Christmas every year by eating sashimi. Of course, this had become quite a strange Christianity with time.
Yeah.
And then when I was in Japan, of course, I did not expect to find any living reminiscence of the Portuguese. But then it turned out that even today, on a small island outside of Nagasaki, there are still a few people who practice this hidden Christianity until this day. And I met an old woman in her 80s, and she showed me the secret statues that she was keeping for the community. And this was meeting the past in the present.
I can imagine that must be beautiful. Well, now what about meeting the present in the present or the future in the present? Travel has become a huge industry. There are all these travel influencers, travel bloggers, Instagrammers. Do you encounter these people when you travel?
Very rarely, because once I said the world is getting smaller and smaller, and that is of course not true. The world has the same size as it has ever had, but more and more people are traveling to the same places. But most of the world is still untouched by mass tourism. That's
good to hear. No, because we have this fear of, there might not be anything left to discover, and we feel this nostalgia of everything being known. But it's actually not true, you say?
It's not true at all. And also, I think, and I've seen this many places, on the surface, it might look like everything is becoming the same. People, they have handies, mobile phones, and they have jeans, and they drink Coke. But then if you dig a little bit deeper, you still find that they live very local lives. So you have globalization living side by side by this very local culture. So I'm not concerned that cultures are disappearing, but of course cultures are changing all the time, and that's how it has always been. This started also with the Portuguese, and after the discoveries of the Portuguese, the world became global. It's a globalization began with the Portuguese. There were a few places where there were mass tourism, like the island Sal of Cape Verde. I was just there for 2 days. Mm-hmm. And of course, Goa. There you meet quite a lot of Indian influences as well. So they go to Goa to have a kind of a break from the rest of India.
Yeah. And what about your experiencing climate change or the impact of climate change, endangered species and, places you just can't visit anymore because it's getting too hot? Do you actually experience the immediate effect of climate change when you travel?
Sometimes, but climate change is happening very fast, but also so slowly, so it can be difficult to kind of see the immediate effect. But of course, when I was traveling in the Himalaya, a lot of the glaciers, they are disappearing. And now they have changed Everest base camp because that glacier was becoming too unstable, so they had to change the base camp. When I was writing The Border, because of climate change, I was able to travel through the Northeast Passage, which used to be very difficult to pass by because of the ice, but now the ice is melting and it's becoming accessible. And that is, of course, it's tragic what is happening, and the global, climate change is happening, I think, 4 times as fast in the Arctic as anywhere else.
Yes. So you do see signs of that, and it impacts your travel sometimes directly.
Yes, but it's difficult to see also because I'm kind of traveling fast. So
you are traveling fast?
Not. Yeah. Well, everything is relative.
I would rethink that. Spending 50 days on a freight vessel.
Yeah, okay.
Instead of taking the plane.
Yeah, that's true. It's maybe not exactly high speed traveling, but like anthropologists, when they do their research, they would usually stay in one place in 1 year, and I stay maybe a month, and so in 1 month you don't see changes happening. You might see the result of changes that have happened.
Right. Okay. Oh, well, do you have your next journey mapped out already?
I do. I have ideas for many books. I think I will be busy until I retire, if I ever retire. So yes, I do have plans for next book ready. But my books take time, so the book will not be out this year, and it will not be out next year. Of course.
But you cannot share what your plans are, or you don't want to. You want to keep it a secret.
For a little bit longer, yes.
Okay, I do understand that. And in any case, your latest book has just come out, The Navigator's Journey Through a Lost Empire. Erika, thank you so much for being here with us today. Thank you so much for this conversation. To the listeners, the German translation of Erika's book is titled Seefahrer, eine Reise durch Portugals vergangenes Weltreich, out now with Insel Publishers. If you're interested in learning more about the programs of Surkamp and Insel, or about Erika's work or her other books that are also available, don't hesitate to drop us a line at podcast@surkamp.de. Thank you for listening. Dichtung und Wahrheit ist ein Podcast der Verlage Surkamp und Insel, produziert von Bose Park Productions.